What the hell am I doing here? Like, genuinely, why am I here? Why do you guys love watching me suffer like this? So, some time ago, I had randomly come across this video by a channel called Infrared, proof that Stalin and Mao were libertarian. Now, initially, as any rational man would assume, I thought this was some kind of April Fool's video or a Wow Mao style satire video, so I naturally clicked on it. And as the minutes went by, the smirk on my mouth slowly faded away until I came to the dreadful conclusion that, dear God, this was an unironic video. Now, the guy who made this video is one Haz Al-Din, who is probably most well known for being the guy who screamed that he was proud of being a Mongoloid in that one Wow Mao video.
Well, you're just talking like a Mongoloid.
I don't give a f***, I am a Mongoloid. In my heart, I'm a Mongoloid. That is what I am. We are Ward. That is what we are.
But our boy didn't just stop there. He is both an online and IRL political activist, being the founder of the ACP, the American Communist Party, and yes, he is a communist. Now officially he is a co-founder, with the other being the infamous Jackson Hinkle. But I just assume Haz is the official founder since he is the one mainly going on camera and organizing stuff, while Hinkle is almost nowhere to be seen. So if you ask me, I think this is one of those cases where you give your little brother the unplugged controller and have him think he is also playing the game. But the ACP, compared to other communist parties and organizations, is kinda unique to say the least. Reason being that all the other tankies see them as the reincarnation of the Italian Fascist Party because they are socially more right-wing and conservative. Anti-woke, anti-trans, pro-nuclear family, all that stuff. Basically, they are mid-20th century communists before they embrace the whole social justice warrior ideology. And I genuinely have to praise and applaud them here, because they actually do amazing work in regards to activism and charity. They document it all on their official Twitter page. They clean up local parks and other public spaces, offer services to elderly veterans free of charge like cleaning up their yards, participate in flood reliefs for those affected, and even have their own workshops where they teach their members skills like carpentry, welding, and woodwork.
We're here teaching some practical skills to our cadre members. We're teaching them how to pull a tape measure, how to use a skill saw, a table saw, building up that blue collar culture and making sure that they know the very basics of carpentry. Los Angeles is definitely a place where we have issues with landlords who don't want to take care of people's homes. And so eventually we'd like to get to a point where we have an army of blue-collar workers with the practical skills necessary to send them out into the community to really help build up people's homes, businesses, so they don't have to rely on expensive contractors that are going to overcharge them and break the bank.
So again, I think Haz and the other organizers of the ACP very much deserve praise and a huge W in this regard. They are not just sitting on their asses and moral fagging on the internet, but actually have real impacts on their communities and those around them. And it's a positive one at that. Insanely ironic how the only communist group that builds more stuff than it destroys is the one that isn't even fully left-wing. Just let that sink in for a moment. But getting back on track now, because Haz is socially conservative compared to other communists, he tries to synthesize figures like Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao into a more right-wing adjacent worldview, not just arguing that they are compatible, but that they are only compatible with that, and that they truly understand them and their ideas. And this effort leads to some of the most schizo things coming out of this man's mouth I have ever heard of. And that is how you get stuff like this, with him arguing that Mao and Stalin were actually libertarians. Listen, Haz, I like you more compared to other commies and tankies, and you can genuinely be funny at times.
All right-wing infighting is like who can out-schizo retard who. They're like, well, you know how they fight? They're like, actually, Putin is the Jew, and NATO is the Aryan. Like, no, NATO's the Jew, and Putin's... And then the guy goes, you're all Jews! The guy Shlomo Rubinstein controls all of this!
But you really gotta stop smoking that Randy Marsh integrity weed. Maybe or maybe not does this video deserve a response, but I know for a fact that the title and thumbnail will have immense clickbait potential. And you guys love it when I respond to stupid shit and treat it more seriously than others. So let's just jump straight in and genuinely see what Haz has to say on the matter and what kind of arguments he is prepared to bring.
Stalin and Mao, because of conventional prejudices, have the reputation of epitomizing, big government. Because it's just what you think, but you haven't thought critically about it on the basis of an analysis of actual historical fact and evidence. You haven't looked through the fucking evidence. You actually haven't read any real, neutral, scientific historiography on Stalin or Mao. You just read that fucking stupid infographic fucking show on YouTube, and because of the weight of this prejudice that Stalin and Mao represent big government, could it possibly fucking occur to you that every fucking turn of their political career, Stalin and Mao strived for cheap, efficient, and yes, limited government at the expense of their own party bureaucracy?
One thing I will absolutely agree with them on is that the infographic shows are absolute normie slop. Yes, even in regards to figures like Mao and Stalin. I have also stopped using the Mach killed gorillions and gorillions of people talking point, because at some point you just gotta recognize that Stalin didn't personally behead tens of thousands of Ukrainian babies. But the other things are just wrong at best. So he makes the point that because Stalin and Mao faced pushback from the party bureaucracy, that this was proof that they wanted a cheap and limited government, with his tweet on screen reading, quote, "Stalin and Mao strived for cheap, efficient, and limited government. At every turn, their efforts were obstructed by party bureaucracy, both ultra-leftists and rightists." Which, phew, that is a stretch to say the least. Okay, but this doesn't prove that they were against big government, because have you maybe considered the possibility that some corners of the party bureaucracy opposed them not because they advocated for limited government, but because they didn't agree with them politically? Yeah, surprise, surprise, one-party states have ideological factionalism, and several of these factions don't like each other very much. The Soviet Union after Lenin's death was a good example. You had the left opposition led by Trotsky, the right opposition led by Bukharin, and the general party line by Stalin. And all three of these despised one another, because they all wanted to succeed Lenin. Stalin didn't fight against these party bureaucrats because he wanted to establish a libertarian paradise and despise big government. No, he fought against them in order to get his own men in these positions who were loyal to him and would do his bidding. Haz's logic basically goes like this: if Group X opposes person Y, then Y must hold the opposite of Group X's position. Just because Stalin's opponents were certain types of bureaucrats doesn't mean Stalin's stance was the opposite. Two sides can oppose each other for reasons unrelated to the issue at hand, or they may still share features. In fact, Stalin did the opposite. He immensely expanded the bureaucracy. He ended the new economic policy, which was kind of an early form of market socialism, and shifted to a total command economy where the state had to control everything, what is known in Soviet historiography as the Great Break or Great Turn. And guess what? In order for the state to actually handle and operate basically the entire economy, it needed a monumental expansion of the bureaucratic apparatus. There was a massive increase in planners, officials, and administrators on virtually all levels. You can't further centralize a state without expanding the bureaucracy along with it to manage this newfound control. It's impossible. Like, did Haz even think this one through?
If you don't understand this in the case of Stalin, I'll just be like, yeah, you're a dumbass. You don't know anything about the history of the 1930s or the various factional party struggles that occurred through the 30s up to the Great Purge. You don't know about the 1947 meeting that literally put Stalin on the hit list for all these fucking party bureaucrats. You don't know about any of that shit, fine. But to not understand how Mao wanted cheap, efficient, and limited government, Mao, who literally empowered the Chinese masses, as written in the Unknown Cultural Revolution by Dongfeng Han, to literally set up their own local institutions of governance, administration, and power at the expense of local party bosses who they would literally put dunce caps on and shame. Mao was the guy whose little red books were distributed forms of sovereign authority. Any idiot peasant could wield a red book and literally be the equal of any party boss in their local fucking town. Nobody in China was experiencing tyranny from Mao except the people who were in power all the way in Beijing. If you're a local peasant, the average fucking person in China, the only tyranny you're experiencing is at the level of your local bosses, your local bureaucrats, the local people in power. And Mao, with his Cultural Revolution, empowered peasants to literally, I mean, it's literally like a Ron Paul audit the government, challenge the government. That's what the fucking Cultural Revolution was. These peasants would go and just talk shit to the actual symbols of the government. And they could say anything they wanted. And they had power over them. That's a stereotype of the Cultural Revolution. You don't even need to do any in-depth analysis of what the Cultural Revolution is.
Okay. There is a lot to unpack here, so he is mainly talking about the Cultural Revolution here. The true purpose of the Cultural Revolution was strengthening the power of the chairman and a general purge of the Chinese Communist Party of people Mao considered to be disloyal to him. Even before the start of the Cultural Revolution, Mao got paranoid and feared that he would be forced to step down from the party. The Great Leap Forward was an economic disaster, and Mao's policies led to the Great Famine, which killed around 30 million people. Safe to say, there were lots of people wanting to pick a bone with him, especially within the party. Dutch historian Frank Dikötter, in his masterful work on the Chinese Cultural Revolution, writes in what kind of position Mao found himself in before the Cultural Revolution. Quote, Mao saw no distinction between himself and the revolution. He was the revolution. An inkling of dissatisfaction with his authority was a direct threat to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And there were many challenges to his position. In 1956, some of the chairman's closest allies had used Khrushchev's secret speech to delete all references to Mao Zedong thought from the constitution and criticize the cult of personality. Mao was seething, yet had little choice but to give in. The biggest setback, however, came in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, a catastrophe on an unprecedented scale directly caused by his own obstinate policies. Mao was hardly paranoid in believing that many of his colleagues wanted him to step down, holding him responsible for the mass starvation of ordinary people. Plenty of rumors were circulating, accusing him of being deluded, innumerate, and dangerous. His entire legacy was in jeopardy. The chairman feared that he would meet the same fate as Stalin, denounced after his death. And even before the Cultural Revolution, back in 1964, Mao very much hinted at a coming purge, stating, quote, "We must punish this party of ours." Now, Mao had the power for this to be just another party purge, nothing out of the ordinary. But again, it wasn't just about that, but about his entire legacy. Dikötter said Mao feared that he would have the Stalin treatment after his death, with a Chinese Khrushchev rising to the top. So he killed two birds with one stone. Not only would the Cultural Revolution purge those deemed disloyal and out of line, but would also reshape his legacy and make people forget that those previous blunders were mainly his doing. For that reason, Mao mobilized the masses, the students, workers, and the peasants to take up arms and purge those he called class enemies, capitalist roaders, and revisionists. He accused them of orchestrating the failures of the famine and Great Leap Forward, that he had nothing to do with it, and that he was on the side of the people to get rid of those traitors and parasites once and for all. The parasites in question being party members and officials who did not exactly agree with his policies. Thus the party would be purged of dissidents, and the people would be convinced that they got their justice, and thus elevate Mao once again to the level of national hero. Look, I'm sorry, but I just have to admire how absolutely Machiavellian and genius Mao's strategy was in regards to the Cultural Revolution. And now coming back to Haz's point, were the locals quote-unquote empowered by the Cultural Revolution, and did they establish their own local boards and governments? Nope. Let's take the January Storm event as an example, where the People's Commune overthrew the Municipal Committee and formed the Shanghai People's Commune, similar to the Paris Commune. They wanted to implement things like direct democracy and truly empower the locals. You wanna know what happened? The Commune collapsed and order was restored by military officers of the PLA who held supreme authority. It wasn't returned to the people. Andrew G. Walder in his book China Under Mao writes about how these revolutionary committees actually worked. Quote, "They identified a senior official who demonstrated unswerving loyalty to Mao's line and who was able to earn the support of a significant portion of local rebel forces, and placed that person in charge of the power seizure. 3 more provincial power seizures of this kind were approved by mid-February: Guizhou, Shandong, and Shaanxi. In each case, Beijing officials were able to identify a sufficiently senior local official who had demonstrated loyalty to the CCRG's agenda and who had the support of a large segment of the rebel insurgency. In each case, their power seizure stimulated rebel opposition of the variety experienced in Shanghai, and in each case, the new leaders, with the backing of Mao, Zhou, and the CCRG, deployed the armed forces to shut down opposition." Is this your idea of the people and peasants being empowered, Haz? If your revolutionary committee had to first be approved from Beijing rather than you directly being able to empower whoever you wanted, then you're not the one pulling the strings, my guy. The Cultural Revolution was never about empowering the people and peasants. It merely gave the appearance of such a thing in order for the people to unleash their pent-up anger and frustration at Mao's opponents, who then installed their own loyal party bosses there. So I guess congrats on falling for Mao's engineered propaganda.
Now, in the case of Stalin, you may be so stupid that you go around using the name Stalin without understanding the crucial context, like the 1936 Stalin Constitution, which was the most democratic constitution in the history of humanity, possibly up until this point, which, yes, did establish limited government. If we define government that is limited by some kind of formal procedures and protocols, Stalin was fundamentally anti-bureaucratic in his orientation, and yes, at every opportunity and chance he got, he wanted to severely limit the scope of government and establish a cheap, efficient, simple government.
You can't just throw out a claim like the 1936 Stalin Constitution was the most democratic constitution in the history of humanity without elaborating specifically on what was so democratic about it. Limited government, as in government limited by some kind of formal procedures and protocols? Yeah, I am calling complete bullshit on that. Stalin and the Politburo repeatedly interfered in the planning process of, for example, the economy, with apparently no justification whatsoever. Stalin would be like God in Genesis and say, "Let there be light," and everyone would obey his command. Now, that is not to say that he wouldn't listen to other people's opinions on certain matters. He did do that, like when he greatly scaled down the size of planned grain collection in 1932 after hearing the reports from the localities on how severe the consequences would be. But still, besides whether you find that concept based or not, one guy being able to decide things on whim with no limit whatsoever is not a limited government, even in Haz's definition. In fact, you could argue things became less democratic with the 1936 Stalin Constitution because after 1936, the Politburo effectively existed in name only. As Paul Gregory writes on this in his book on Stalin's command economy, quote, "Even before 1936, the Politburo effectively rubber-stamped decisions. After 1936, the Politburo existed largely only in name. To all intents and purposes, the Soviet Union already from 1933 was under Stalin's personal dictatorship. This does not mean that other leaders were unimportant, or that there was no consultation, but Stalin was the supreme authority whom no one could contradict. There were no mechanisms whereby Stalin could be outvoted or removed from office. Thus, the terror of 1936 to 1938 did not create a Stalin dictatorship. It only transformed an existing dictatorship into a tyranny." Like, genuinely, I wish I could get my hands on that Randy Marsh Tegrity weed. It sounds like you would have the trip of a lifetime.
In 1944, for the first time during the war, there was a joint convocation of both the Central Committee and a session of the Supreme Soviet. Molotov and Malenkov prepared a draft for the Central Committee, according to which the party would be legally distanced from power. And this is consistent with what Beria's son said what Stalin wanted to do, because Stalin thought the party lords, the party bureaucrats, were a bunch of lazy do-nothings. He literally wanted to strip power from the party and give it to the institution of Soviet democracy. The party would be legally distant from power. It would retain only agitation and propaganda. It simply forbade the party from interfering in economics and working of the organs of the state. Stalin read the draft, changed 6 words, and wrote agreed on it. What happened next was a mystery, because Khrushchev and all these fucking people dropped it. They erased it from history. This is in continuity with what Stalin was trying to do in his 1936 constitution.
I was personally betting $10 that he was gonna bring up Grover Furr as a source, the David Irving of the Tankies himself. For those of you who don't know, Furr is a professor of medieval English literature at Montclair State University, and for some reason this meant they U-turned from medieval English literature and straight onto Stalinist Russia apologetics. He wrote several books, one of his most notable being Khrushchev Lied, where he shows that the majority of things Khrushchev spoke of at his famous speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality were in fact lies. Some of his other views include, but are not limited to, denying the Holodomor and saying it was a fabrication made up by Ukrainian nationalists, the Katyn massacre, where the Soviets carried out mass executions of Poles, was actually committed by the SS and not the NKVD, all defendants in the Moscow trials of the Great Purge really were guilty, the purpose of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was to preserve Poland and not partition it, and that the Soviet Union did not invade Poland in 1939 because technically at that point the Polish state did not exist. If you're gonna accuse me of committing the poisoning the well fallacy, then okay fine, you're right, I did do that just now. But let's try to take what Furr wrote here in consideration. So Furr is quoting a second-hand source here from one Yuri Zhukov. I looked up that name and he is a Russian historian who published books glorifying Joseph Stalin. Oh god, it's another author circle jerk, is it? Yuri is also known for arguing that Stalin was not responsible for the Great Purge and that it was actually done by Jews. So I checked out the source for that quote Furr cited. It is, quote, full text of the resolution is in Zhukov's Stalin. See also Zhukov's earlier treatment in Tiny 270-276, where the text is also reproduced. Yuri does have a work titled Stalin Secrets of State Power, so I am just gonna assume that is what Furr is referring to here. Unfortunately, I did not manage to find that book anywhere on the internet to check whether Yuri gave another more primary source for that, or if there wasn't a source cited at all. But I guess it will remain a mystery since we have run into a dead end. Now, I am not gonna pretend like being any kind of apologist is inherently bad and that your opinion should automatically be dismissed, because then I'd be a hypocrite since I too have produced some works and videos that could be labeled as apologetic. But I think there is a fair difference between mild and more reasonable apologetics and straight up schizo batshit insane ones, and from what I am seeing, Grover Furr and Yuri Zhukov fall more into the latter category. If Furr quoted a primary source, a direct report or something from one of Stalin's officials or someone from the Politburo, then okay, I would entertain it for a moment longer and do some more digging. But quoting let's say a dubious second-hand source, while you yourself are seen as dubious, doesn't really inspire 100% confidence. Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe Yuri in his work did cite a primary source for what was being said, but unfortunately I am unable to check it. But let's assume for one moment that this whole thing is legit. I am genuinely curious. What were those 6 words Stalin changed? Yuri does not provide us with information here on what they were. In any kind of document, particularly a political one, changing a few words, even as few as 6, can change pretty much the entire point and contents of the document. But since we don't know what those words were, we are only left with more questions than answers. This is not the definitive evidence Haz thinks it is.
Sheila Fitzpatrick tells the story of young Komsomols engaged in activism. Now, what does activism mean? It meant challenging authorities and challenging the corruption of the authorities. The struggle against the corruption and obscurantism of local officials. They invoked the name of Stalin only in order to challenge the actual local tyrants and forces of corruption, bureaucracy, and big government at the local level.
Okay, I don't see how that proves anything. I mean, the Chinese students during the Cultural Revolution were also invoking Mao's name while struggling against local officials, and we know how that truly went. They were merely pawns for Mao to secure his power further and blame everything going wrong on other officials. So why would it be unreasonable to assume that the same thing wasn't going on here in the Soviet Union? Young people invoking Stalin's name in an anti-corruption activism doesn't prove anything.
So look what Stalin says. Some comrades think that the thing to do is to simply nationalize collective farm property to proclaim it public property. The collective farm was a civil economic institution, not a state one. It wasn't exactly private property under a classical capitalism, but it was not state property. These were collective farms owned by the people working on them. You may think the idea of a collective farm is scary, whatever. This is perfectly in continuity with Russian civilization. The commune, the mir, was a fact of Russian peasant life for hundreds of years. They've always owned the land in common in Russia. Individual land ownership was a foreign artificial innovation created by Stolypin. Stolypin created the artificial institution of individual land ownership. That's what gave rise to the kulaks. We Americans like individual ownership, but it's not part of Russian culture.
Okay, first of all, the article written by Stalin as pictured by Haz was written in 1952, almost 20 years since the collectivization of agriculture. And second of all, okay, so the claim that farms and agriculture were not state property but owned collectively by the peasants is partially true but highly misleading. So, under Stalin, the agricultural sector consisted primarily of 2 types of farms. State farms known as sovkhozy, which were explicitly state property, and their workers were state employees who received wages. Then you had the collective farms known as kolkhozy, which were legally defined as voluntary cooperatives where members pooled their land and resources and in theory could do what they wanted with them. But the autonomy of the kolkhozy existed on paper only. In reality, their autonomy was very limited, and the state still held ultimate control over them. As Alec Nove in his Economic History of the USSR describes it, quote, "The kolkhoz was declared to be a voluntary cooperative, whose members had pooled their means of production in order to produce in common. The members ran their own affairs, and elected a chairman and a management committee responsible to a meeting of all members. The kolkhoz was, however, bound to obey instructions from local state and party organs on matters of agricultural production and procurements, so in practice its operational autonomy was severely limited. The Rayon, District Party Organization, the MTS, the Rayon Agricultural Department, issued numerous orders to the chairman, and the party secretary in particular had the effective power of appointment and dismissal." I am also gonna quote Oleg Khlevniuk and his biography of Stalin, where he describes how the collectivization process went, and this may shock you, but they weren't as voluntary as the piece of paper suggests. Quote, "While 7.5% of the country's peasant households belonged to kolkhozes as of 1st of October 1929, by the 20th of February 1930, that percentage had reached 52.7. Underlying this statistic was a horrific and tragic reality. People sent from the city or mobilized from the local population to carry out collectivization behaved like conquering hordes toward a defeated enemy. Anyone who refused to enter the kolkhoz was arrested arrested and beaten. The plundering of quote-unquote dekulakized property and the raping of women were standard. So, in less than 6 months, the amount of households belonging to collective farms went from 7.5% to 52.7%. You mind elaborating on how that happened, Haz? Did the Russian peasants collectively attain some will and consciousness to go and happily toil the soil on those farms? Yeah, as it turns out, anyone who didn't want to go work on them was beaten and arrested. If collective farms were really part of Russian culture and individual land ownership was this alien entity, why was the number of collective farms so low in 1929? And why did it take state coercion, violence, and plundering to make that number go up? Doesn't sound very libertarian of Mr. Stalin now, does it?
So you're saying, well, the collective farm doesn't own all these other things, the state does. All that means is they can't sell the land. They can't buy and sell the land, which is a good thing, because speculation on land, which the buying and selling of land eventually leads to monopolies, debt, banking monopolies, things libertarians don't like. But as far as the fundamentals of a libertarian economy, where people own their own products of their labor and get to do whatever they want with them on the market and shit, Stalin gives them way more freedom. You have more freedom when the land is public. You have more freedom when the instruments of production are public, depending on which instruments. I mean, there's a range of what that means. In China, it's just the land. The instruments are not public property, for example.
Holy shit, the reach there. He is basically saying, yeah, you have quotas that you need to fulfill for the state, and then the state will come and take a portion of your own hard work and labor, but you can still do whatever you wanted with what was left. That means Stalinist Russia was a libertarian paradise. That's not how the libertarian position works, Haz. Libertarians advocate for the idea and right for people to do whatever they want with the things they earn and make. Not the surplus left over from a quota, but the entire thing. The state would not have the right to come over and say, hey, give us 60% of all the wheat and grain you guys made this month. But you can do what you want with the 40%. No, that's literally how modern day taxation works, and I don't see libertarians arguing in favor of our modern taxes. If Stalinist Russia was truly a libertarian paradise, there would have been no state quotas at all. No seizure or taxation on the produce of the peasants and farms. They would keep 100% of everything they made and do with it whatever they wanted without the intervention of the state. The mere concept of mandatory quotas you need to fill goes against that entire idea.
All I mean by libertarian is a general tendency toward wanting to limit the scope and scale of government and the powers of government. Doesn't mean he wanted a weak state. He wanted a very strong state, and he made that much as explicit. Strong doesn't mean bloated. Strong doesn't mean bureaucracy. Strong means simple, clean, and to the task. Stalin, relative to his contemporaries, was a libertarian. He wanted to strengthen the civil institutions of the people at the expense of the centralizing state institutions. Stalin, at every turn, wanted to give power to the people, and it was his own party bureaucracy that tried to stop him. And after he died, Khrushchev reversed all this, abolished the kolkhoz markets, and that's where the totalizing state machine, the completely inefficient, bureaucratic, broken Soviet state machine, has its origins in. Khrushchev's reign of glasses-wearing technocrats completely destroyed the fucking Soviet Union. It destroyed the popular basis of the state. It's the collective farm that was the basis of Stalinism. Khrushchev fundamentally erodes the power of the collective farms. He devastates Soviet agriculture, and Khrushchev increases the power of the urban, institutionalized, state-institutionalized Soviet society. That's not what Stalin wanted to do. Stalin wanted to deepen his institutional reform to be more inclusive to the masses and also more decentralized for the masses. He didn't want one center to dominate everything.
You wanna know who actually advocated for the stuff Haz is talking about here? This thing about not wanting one center to dominate everything and decentralizing stuff more? It was the leader of the right opposition, Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin, compared to other Bolsheviks, had the brain cells to recognize the fact that the city and the village were two completely separate institutions and fields, and they should be approached differently. He advocated for communism in the urban areas, but a strengthened NEP, or market socialism, in the countryside. Gonna quote Nove here again. Quote, Bukharin, who had been a leader of the left wing during the war communism period, became the best known of the leaders of the moderates, the future right-wing deviation in the 20s. He reasoned as follows: NEP is to be persisted with for a long time, for a generation at least. It is out of the question to use force against the peasants. While support for the poor peasants may be politically preferable from the Bolshevik point of view, it is, quote, from the middle and better off peasants that the needed farm surplus will come, and in no circumstances must they be antagonized. On the contrary, they must be encouraged. The alternative policy would bring back the black days of confiscations and gravely endanger the Bolshevik hold on political power, since it would lead to peasant rebellion. Bukharin was in favor of building socialism, but only at a pace which the individual peasant producers could be persuaded to accept. In his view, greater prosperity among the peasants, more commercial production, was not only essential, but was also not dangerous. And for this very reasonable and smart observation, Stalin had Bukharin shot. Unironically, the thing and ideas Haz is talking about here were literally advocated by Bukharin, and Stalin had him killed for having those ideas in the first place. For Stalin, the countryside and the peasants were subservient to the interests of the working class and urban industry. The reason why he went through with the collectivization of the countryside and introducing quotas was to sell all that grain and wheat abroad for dirt cheap prices, so that then he could use that money to finance the 5-year plan and accelerate industrialization. That's what his view on the countryside was. It was simply a source of revenue to finance industrialization further. Haz is literally attributing ideas and words to Stalin of a man who Stalin shot for having those ideas in the first place. And just like that, we have already finished the important parts of the video. I am aware this response video is gonna be on the more shorter side, definitely under 30 minutes, since Haz's video is only 11 minutes long. And he does have longer ones, like this thing where he argues why he is a, quote, libertarian Stalinist for almost 50 minutes. So I guess I am testing the waters here with this video, and you guys should definitely let me know whether I should continue covering Haz and his shenanigans. But still, at the end of the day, I definitely do prefer the ACP compared to other communist parties and organizations. And you know what? I kinda like Haz as well. The schizo stuff makes him kinda appealing, and I commend him for being brave enough to hold those ideas in the first place. Anyway, that is all for today, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks to all the glorious people on Patreon who are supporting me in these endeavors. Special thanks to Mudkips Our Life and SOAV for their extremely generous and high pledges. That really helps me out a lot. Anyway, bye bye!